Chapter 6: The Immediate Ripple, Impact on Their Contemporaries and the Follower Base. In the immediate aftermath of Socrates' public life, what the Athenians saw, heard, and debated about in the agora, the courts, and the little backrooms where drink and rhetoric mingled, the city did not simply gain a man who asked inconvenient questions. It welcomed, and then reluctantly reacted to, a method. The Socratic method elenchus rendered into conversation, a probing of definitions that began with why and what and who and ended with whether any man can truly know what virtue is, left an imprint not so much as a doctrine but as a way of thinking. The ripples of that imprint appeared, almost at once, in the people who met Socrates, admired or resented him, argued with him, or simply tried to imitate the staccato cadence of his questions. What follows is not a single, tidy account of philosophy's history, but a portrait of the immediate social weather that followed Socrates' method into the city's public life and private conversations. It describes how contemporaries absorbed, resisted, and rearranged their own aims in light of a stranger who refused to let comfortable certainties pass unexamined. The gadfly of Athens and the social paradox of his brilliance. To understand the immediate ripple, one must begin with the first, stubborn fact: Socrates was a provocateur who did not offer a system so much as a perpetual invitation to scrutinize systems. His method did not declare an answer and leave it unexamined, it demanded that every answer be tested by the test of questions. And in a time and place where reputation, status, piety, and civic duty were policed by oral argument, such a habit could seem both dangerous and exhilarating. The man stood among Athenians not as a preacher but as a conversationalist whose power lay in the stubborn courtesy of asking, always asking, until a belief buckled. Contemporaries who met Socrates at the market, in the gymnasium, at the temple, or in the courts found themselves drawn into a public conversation that felt intimate and subversive at once. Some were attracted to the energy of his inquiries, which seemed to illuminate a path from ignorance to a kind of clarity that no conventional teacher had promised. Others recoiled, sensing that the method could erode the very foundations of customary life: reverence for the gods, respect for social roles, and deference to authority. In the immediate wake of his presence, Athens learned that a man could be fearless in confessing ignorance about the most basic of matters: piety, virtue, justice, without surrendering moral seriousness. The ripple, then, did not merely spread a method, it unsettled a temperament, a habit of asking, the willingness to be shown wrong, the courage to listen to the counterexample even when it bruised pride. The rhetoric of danger and exposure. The danger associated with Socrates' approach was not just intellectual, it was social and political. In a city that prized civic virtue and shared pieties as glue for the polis, a man who insisted that almost every ordinary claim about virtue and righteousness required evidence could be read as a subversion of moral consensus. When Socrates pressed the idea that the unexamined life might not be worth living, he presented a standard of virtue that did not align neatly with official ritual or the conventional wisdom beloved by many who held the reins of power or influence. Some neighbors interpreted his questions as meddling, a habit of corroding trust and provoking envy among those who preferred to maintain the surface smoothness of consensus rather than risk the jagged geometry of critical inquiry. To many listeners, the method seemed scandalously practical. It treated virtue as a problem to be solved through argument, not as a gift from ancestral piety or a sanction granted by tradition. This practical efficacy, the ability to force a person to examine the grounds of their own beliefs, could be seen as a kind of moral medicine. Yet if the medicine was harsh enough, it could injure the pride of those who believed themselves guardians of both public virtue and private virtue's ritual forms. The immediate ripple is thus legible in the city's response, a mixture of admiration for the courage to question and anxiety about the consequences of widespread doubt. The dissenters and the curious coexisted in the same streets, sometimes validating Socrates' approach by adopting it in their own disputes, other times lampooning or persecuting him as a threat to the social order. The clouds and the counterforces, cultural reception in the agora and the theater. Aristophanes' Clouds gives a conspicuously early indication of how the contemporary culture received Socrates and the method he popularized. In a city where theater was both entertainment and moral commentary, the dramatic caricature of Socrates as an incurably clever but morally dubious trickster serves as an artifact of the immediate ripple, a public ritual in which satire tested the limits of intellectual audacity. The play did not merely mock a man, it signaled a wider cultural fear. If someone could reduce piety to a problem of definition and render civic virtue contingent on relentless questioning, then the shared life of the city might drift toward a state in which nothing stood beyond critique. The clouds did not end Socrates' influence, it amplified a chorus of voices that would continue to debate the person and the method. Some Athenians came away from such performances convinced that Socrates' approach was dangerous sophistry. Others came away with a sense that a new kind of intellectual life was possible, one that insisted on coherence and self-scrutiny even in the heat of public life. What the method did to young minds, and what certain adults did with those minds. The follower base of Socrates, the imaginative, often younger, cohort who found in his questions a way to test themselves and their elders, formed the most conspicuous part of the immediate ripple. These were not a single, unified school with a constitution and a creed, they were a circle bound together by shared experiences of dialogue, challenge, and the sometimes exasperating fidelity of 2 or 3 men who believed that learning began with unlearning certainties. The shape and trajectory of that circle varied across time and temperament, and its members pursued divergent paths after contact with Socrates' method. Plato stands at the center of this circle as the most conspicuous, enduring conduit of Socrates' influence. But it is an inaccurate simplification to imagine Plato as merely his pupil who later founded a school. In the immediate aftermath, Plato's engagement with Socrates was not a simple transmission of a doctrine but the embodiment of a distinctive mode of life, a way of questioning that could become metaphysical and systematic, yet always return to the living dialogue with a person in front of you rather than to a fixed text. Plato refracted the experience of Socrates into a theory, often presenting it as a philosophical architecture built upon the method's core practice, asking, testing, and refining through dialogue. The consequence was not merely the preservation of Socratic questions but the elevation of the confrontational, dynamic exchange into a philosophical project that would outlive Athens. Xenophon, by contrast, preserved a more practical, perhaps temperate record of Socrates' character and method. In his Memorabilia and other writings, Socrates appears as a moral interlocutor who trains the mind toward courage, temperance, and practical wisdom. The tragedy of the trial and the respect of the city's citizens who admired his ethical steadfastness are not depicted here as a metaphysical system but as a life of disciplined examination. For Xenophon, the followers' base appears as a cohort of citizens who wish to cultivate virtue in ordinary life through disciplined conversation, more humanely pragmatic, less idealistically metaphysical. Yet even Xenophon's grounded portrait serves as a conduit for the method's immediate ripple. It demonstrates that the Socratic approach could be both a personal discipline and a social craft, adaptable to different temperaments and ends. Other members of the circle reveal the spectrum of possible afterlives for Socratic method. Alcibiades, the charismatic general and political actor, embodies a paradox, the admiration of Socratic questioning paired with a political life that pursued shifting loyalties and strategic brilliance. In Plato's dialogues, Alcibiades appears as a student who is both dazzled by Socratic inquiry and susceptible to the seductions of power. The ripple here is instructive, a method that interrogates conventional virtue, when allied with political energy, can be weaponized for personal ends. The danger was not in the method itself but in the misalignment between a questioning ethos and a polity that rewarded audacity and cunning, sometimes over principled reflection. Critias, a figure who emerges from the same circle with a different fate, exposes another dimension of the ripple. A nephew of the reform-minded noble family and a participant in revolutionary political action, Critias later becomes a leading figure among the 30 tyrants who briefly seized control of Athens after the Peloponnesian War. If Socrates' method was a tool for moral examination, the presence of Critias among his circle suggests a troubling possibility. Could the same habit of relentless questioning, when fused with political ambition and the authority of a rigorous, confident personality, be deployed to manipulate a crowd or to justify coercive rule? The early ripple thus includes cautionary tales. The same instrument that purifies belief can, in the wrong hands, instrument the will to power. The Cynics and Megarians, a downstream ripple that circles back. The immediate ripple extended beyond the inner circle to other schools and philosophers who took the Socratic habit of questioning in different directions. Antisthenes, often counted among Socrates' closest students in later tradition, took the method into a path that would become cynicism. The Cynics took the Socratic demand for authenticity and radicalized it into a critique of social pretensions and conventional symbols of virtue. Diogenes of Sinope, the most famous figure associated with cynicism, would become the quintessential embodiment of living in accordance with reason, plenty, and natural virtue, often in stark opposition to social norms. The ripple here is the social transmutation of everyday life. Not only were questions being asked in the agora, but a different moral philosophy was arising that urged people to cast off status symbols, to reduce their needs, and to treat propriety itself as a form of social performance to be scrutinized. Meanwhile, the Megarian school, represented by Euclid of Megara, often linked to a dialectical approach that stressed logical clarity and the primacy of distinctions, took the Socratic spirit into the arena of reasoning and syllogistic rigor. This downstream ripple was not merely a philosophical diffusion, it was a recalibration of argument itself, the habit of forcing a precise articulation of premises, definitions, and consequences. The direct line from Socrates' Elenchus to the Megarian and Cynic movements shows how the immediate ripple did not stop with a single voice but rather branched out into a communal practice of critique, a culture of argument that would influence the entire tradition of Greek philosophy. The political horizon, a city in dialogue with itself. The immediate ripple did not stay in the intimate rooms and streets of daily life, it pressed outward into Athens's political imagination. The philosophy of questioning became, for a broad swath of Athenians, a mirror in which the city could see itself anew. In the longer arc of Athenian history, Socrates' approach contributed to a civic self-consciousness, citizens who did not merely accept the commands of their elders but debated, tested, and offered alternatives. The fallout of this mindset was complex. On one hand, it nourished a climate of critical debate that contributed to a lively, if volatile, democratic culture in which dissent could be publicly voiced and defended. On the other hand, it risked destabilizing the shared customs and reverence necessary for a peaceful social order, especially during periods of political strain, war, and upheaval. The immediate ripple thus displayed a tension embedded in the social utility of a method designed to illuminate virtue and justice, but whose indulgence could also mock or undermine the very institutions that required loyalty and obedience. Leaving behind a trace, the seeds of an ongoing tradition. Even in these early, contested moments, the method left a trace that was neither easily erased nor fully domesticated. A city that could produce such a method could not quite undo it. The follower base, the circle around Socrates, formed the nucleus of a long-term philosophical heritage that would outgrow its Athens origin. Plato's dialogues would render Socrates as a figure who could be both leader of a moral inquiry and the foundation of a metaphysical system. Xenophon and others would preserve a more practical, civic, and moral spiritual portrait of Socrates as a model of courage, temperance, and integrity. The immediate ripple, in its best form, is a reminder that philosophy begins not with a doctrine but with a practice of living inquiry that invites others to think, challenge, and refine their own reasons for living well. The personal and social consequences for those who encountered him. Among the immediate consequences for the contemporaries who encountered Socrates was a reorientation of what it meant to be a student, a citizen, and a friend. For some, the conversation was a model of intellectual fidelity, the habit of sticking with a question until it yields a meaningful, defendable answer. For others, it was a test of character. Could one continue to perform one's civic duties with the same confidence if one's cherished beliefs no longer stood on safe ground? The ripple touched politics, too. Alcibiades' brilliance and ambition show how Socratic questioning could be harnessed by charismatic leaders to sharpen political acuity. Critias' ruthless manipulation of power after the murder of his dialogue partner demonstrates the darker possibility: a method of scrutinizing beliefs could, in the hands of a determined individual, become a tool for fear and coercion, raising the sobering question of responsibility in the life of inquiry. The moral balance, the method as a social catalyst. The immediate ripple was a catalyst for social inquiry rather than a tidy, lasting system. It catalyzed debates about education, virtue, the aims of life, and the role of the philosopher in a polis. It exposed the vulnerability of the social fabric, the ease with which a community can drift from shared values when interrogated beliefs clash with personal ambitions or political realities. Yet it also offered a counterbalance, a community could be reminded to examine its own pieties, its public rituals, and its leaders' claims. The method invited a form of liberal education rooted not in mastery over facts alone but in mastery over one's own convictions. In this sense, the immediate ripple contained a seed of what would become a long, unsettled, and living tradition, a tradition that would continue to debate what counts as knowledge, what constitutes virtue, and how to live justly in a world of competing opinions. Conclusion: the living shadow of a living method. Chapter 6 has traced the immediate ripple of Socrates' life and method, the way contemporaries reacted, the ways in which their lives and thoughts were shaped by his example, and the diverse paths his followers pursued. The mood of Athens in the years following his trial and execution was a mood of oscillation between reverence and fear, between gratitude for a method that could press a person to clarity and anxiety about the social consequences of public interrogation. The follower base, Plato and Xenophon, Alcibiades and Critias, Antisthenes and Diogenes, Euclid of Megara, and others, did not simply copy a single doctrine, they absorbed a habit, a way of asking, and an impulse to test the ground on which one stands. In the broader arc of the portrait of Socrates, this chapter situates him not only as a solitary figure whose questions unsettled a city, but as the origin of a social and intellectual current that could be both constructive and destabilizing. The immediate ripple demonstrates the paradox at the heart of the Socratic project. A method designed to elevate the life of the mind could, in practice, provoke powerful emotional and political reactions. It provoked not only new arguments but also new kinds of characters: the fearless questioner, the ambitious pupil, the reforming cynic, the cautious admirer, and the politician who could mimic a questioner's rigor while bowing to power. If Socrates' life was a spark, the immediate ripple was the flame that drew others into the room, turned questions into conversations, and set in motion a chain of influence that would outlast his own voice. The followers who gathered around him learned, sometimes by imitation, sometimes by contradiction, that to think well is to act with a certain moral seriousness. They learned, in their different ways, that philosophy begins not with a doctrine to be taught but with a relationship, the relationship between a question and the person who risks the answering, between a mind that is willing to be corrected and a world that demands coherence. The ripple was, in short, a social awakening of sorts, a dawning sense that the life of the mind cannot remain solitary, but must become a shared practice of inquiry. And so the follower base that formed around Socrates, the living memory of his method, laid down roots that would grow, in different soils and through different seasons, into the branches of Western thought. The immediate aftershocks were modest in scale and spectacular in consequence, not a new creed, but a new mood, and a new way of listening to the questions that dare us to live more deliberately.